As many of you know, the MLB award system is very different from the other three major sports. The MLB gives out their MVP awards and other awards to the best player in the American League and National League. This made sense as the AL and NL didn't play each other until 1997, but fast forward to today and it has been implemented that every team will play a series or more against every team in the league. So this begs the question, what if the NBA was set up like this? How would this change the landscape of the NBA, and how would we view all-time legends? Would LeBron have more MVPs during his reign in the East? How many MVPs would Jordan have? Would Kareem have a stronger case as the GOAT? Who would have the longest MVP streak in NBA history? We will answer all these questions in today's video, so I hope you enjoy. So the first era that we're going to talk about is 1955 to 1969, and I decided to put these two decades, I guess technically half a decade, and the 60s together. Starting in 1955, the NBA put out their first MVP trophy. So that's why we're going to start here, and we're going to go through this pretty quickly. I mean, if you're watching this video and you somehow watched this era of basketball live, I'd be very surprised. But for most of us, you could probably guess who's going to take home most of these MVPs, being Bill Russell or a combination of whoever you see on the court right now, including Wilt Chamberlain. So let's look at the stats. As you can see, not really much of a spoiler, but Bill Russell, the best player of this time period, with 7 MVPs, Bob Pettit with 5, and Wilt Chamberlain with 4. And as you see in the bottom right, the fire emoji is going to signal the best streak of the decade, or in this example, a little longer than a decade, which Bill Russell had with 5. No surprise there. But as you can see, the players on the left for the rest of this video are going to end up being the winners, and the player on the right, most of the time, is going to be the second place winner. But in an example that we'll show later, sometimes the second best player wasn't in the opposing conference. But overall, we're going to have the best player from the East and the West. This time period was a little harder just because there was a lot of flip-flopping between teams year to year, but this is the best that we could do with the stats. Once we get into the later decades, it's a lot easier to identify the players in the East and the West. But like we said, we'll go through this quickly. Bill Russell, obviously the best player this time period. But guys like Wilt Chamberlain made a big run towards the end, as he did have 4 in a row, which almost rivaled Bill Russell's 5. So let's get into the 70s. So the 1970s is the first official decade that we'll get into, and this was an interesting one as the ABA merged with them in the middle of this decade, but we're just going to use what we have. As we said earlier, the East and West were in a little bit of a mess, but with all that being said, let's look at the stats of this decade. So the first name that stands out, obviously, when you look at this, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with 7 MVPs, but then we have Bob McAdoo with 3, George Gervin with 2, and as we can see in 1977 and 1978, George Gervin came in second place both years, but in this universe, he ends up getting his first MVP and his second MVP, so this helps him a lot, and Bob McAdoo ends up getting 2 MVPs, which he didn't get before, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar ends up with the longest streak at 4 in a row in this. Obviously, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is one of the greatest players of all time, undoubtedly top 5, I would say undoubtedly top 3, but with 7 MVPs now in this decade alone, this helps his case a lot more to possibly be the greatest player of all time. But we'll have to look into their decades, and a guy in this next decade in the 1980s wants to have a talk with Kareem, and you probably already know who that player is. So this time period, the 1980s, is where many say the NBA took its biggest leap, and I completely agree with that, especially after a disaster of a decade the 1970s kind of was for the NBA. And the guy I was talking about that might have a word with Kareem is Michael Jordan, which he will enter the NBA during this decade. He won't be as prominent as he will in the 90s, but there are 2 guys that we'll talk about right now in the stats that took over this decade. So those two guys that I'm talking about are Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. Magic Johnson with 7 MVPs and Larry Bird with 5. But like I said, Michael Jordan still getting 3 in the 80s despite only coming in 1984. Magic Johnson, though, has the longest streak with 7 in a row. And he absolutely kills it from 1983 all the way up until the end of the decade in 1989. And we do see Kareem up here, which will add to his total, and we did see him in the last decade completely take over. But this is where we get to see a big change in the NBA, and I want to mention Larry Bird too, who also has 5 MVPs in this decade, but won them all in a row from 81 up until 85, which then it changed and Michael Jordan became the king of the East. So, with all this in mind, talking about Michael Jordan, let's get into the 90s, where he can prove that he's the best player. So now it's time to talk about the 1990s, which pretty much everyone can agree was probably the best time period in the NBA in history. And, like we talked about before, this will be Michael Jordan's decade, which is no surprise to anyone. But there's going to be a few more names that are going to sneak in here, and maybe a few that might surprise you. So let's get into the stats. So no surprise for the top dogs, Michael Jordan with 6, Karl Malone with 3, but then a 3-way tie for third, with Alonzo Mourning, Shaquille O'Neal, and David Robinson all getting 2 apiece. And the longest streaks of this decade, Michael Jordan with 3 in a row. He did that twice, and Karl Malone with 3 in a row. And that guy that I want to point out that might surprise you is Alonzo Mourning, and we see this happen within history, and it has repeated itself here and will later. We saw earlier George Gervin getting 2 MVPs in a row because he came in second place, but in this universe he gets his MVPs. The same thing happens here with Alonzo Mourning. But obviously this decade, looking at it, Michael Jordan, the greatest player of this decade, and obviously some might say all time. But another few guys I want to talk about in this decade are Clyde Drexler, who gets his MVP in 1991, and Scottie Pippen, who gets his MVP while Michael Jordan's out of the league, and Shaquille O'Neal ends up getting an MVP in 1994, a lot younger than his first MVP in NBA history in 1999. And this is an interesting decade to look at. Obviously, Karl Malone gets another MVP and goes on a three-peat, which might help bring his stock all-time up a little bit, and Alonzo Mourning establishes himself to the common fan as an even better player, getting 2 MVPs during this decade. So now it's time to get into the 2000s, 2000 to 2009 specifically, and this is going to be the start of an era where we're going to see one guy pretty much dominate for most of the time. But for a lot of you guys, you watch this time period, so it'll be interesting to see some players that you might have forgot were as good as they were, and even the second best player in the league, get their MVPs and boost their stock all time. So saying that, let's look at the stats. So at the top of the mountain, we got LeBron James and Tim Duncan with 4 each. Tim Duncan having 4 in a row with the longest streak, and Kobe Bryant gets 3. 2 names I want to point out, 2001 Jason Kidd and 2007 Chris Paul getting their first MVPs in this universe, and LeBron James in 2005 ending up being the youngest MVP of all time at age 22, just a year younger than Derrick Rose at age 22, which we'll see in the next decade. And this is just a preview of how good LeBron James will be in this universe. So, with that in mind, let's just get right into the 2010s up until 2022. So now we've made it to 2010 to 2022 and the current era of the NBA. And to no surprise, we're going to see a lot of LeBron James on here, but we are going to see a lot of guys who didn't end up winning MVP in real life, but in this universe end up getting an MVP or even 2. So let's just get right into it. So obviously, to no one's surprise, we see LeBron James with 9 MVPs in this decade, plus Steph Curry with 3 and Kevin Durant with 3. LeBron James with 8 MVPs in a row, the longest streak. And we see Joel Embiid with MVP in 2020 and 2021. This is being recorded before the 2022-2023 season MVP goes out, so he could get 3 MVPs in this universe. But this just goes on to show how dominant LeBron James was, either being the best player winning MVP or being the second best player in the NBA for 8 years in a row and 9 overall from 2010 to 2022. Whether you want to call it voter fatigue or not, he either was the best player or the second best player in the league for most of this time period. So with all that being said, looking through all these decades, let's look who has the most MVPs, and we'll go through a pyramid, the longest streaks, and who benefited the most from this experiment. So first, we'll just look at the longest streaks. Some of these were shown earlier in the decades, and some were cut off between decades. And in third, we got Bill Russell with 5 in a row from 1960 to 1964. Then Magic Johnson with 8 in a row from 83 to 90. And LeBron James with 10 in a row from 2008 to 2017. So now, let's look at who benefited the most from this experiment. So these are all going to be your first time winners in this universe who didn't end up getting an MVP in real life. And some of the guys winning too are Elgin Baylor, George Gervin, Alonzo Mourning, and Joel Embiid. Some other notable names on here: Jason Kidd, Chris Paul, Scottie Pippen, Pistol Pete, John Havlicek, and Rick Barry, Clyde Drexler too. So these guys in this universe end up getting their first MVP, or even 2 for some of these guys. So now, let's look at the pyramid of greatness. So, on the bottom row, we have Larry Bird and Bob Pettit with 5 each. Tier above that, we got Bill Russell with 7 other Celtics legends. And then the 8-time tier, we have 2 Laker legends, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And then above that, we got Michael Jordan with 9 MVPs. And at the very top of the pyramid, we see LeBron James with 13 MVPs. And this just shows that these players were great for multiple years in a row, either being the best player in the league or the best player in their conference, and maybe the winner that year was in the opposite conference. Especially with this, we can see just how dominant the Lakers and Celtics were from that 55 to the 80s time period, and even towards the end of the 80s. And then we see the resurgence, obviously, with the Lakers with LeBron James, but he obviously wins most of his MVPs in this universe, being in the Eastern Conference on the Cavs or the Heat. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is a little different from our usual content. Usually we only post podcasts, and we have our shorts on here too. So if you like this video, go down below, hit that like button, and put a comment in the comment section below and tell me who you were surprised by the most, and how many MVPs did your favorite player all time end up winning. And I'll see you guys in the next video.